know, but whichever the answer is. But Mary, thank you for having me. And it's good to see everybody. I recognize many familiar names as I was going across here, in a few faces who you have your camera on. It's good to see all of you. As Mary said, I'm Sean. I am a associate professor of social work at Concord down in the South. I see a few folks on here who are from my neck of the woods, and it's good to see you all. I've been here at Concord. This is my 11th year, which is incredibly hard to believe. And during that time, I've been doing these ethics workshops for probably about 8 years would be my guess. So I'm really excited to be with you all and see everybody. I'm also an alum of WVU, and of course proud of that too. So anyway, but it's good to see everybody, and I'm looking forward to spending your lunch hour with you today. And I appreciate you taking this time to, I know you all are probably usually relaxing, but coming and listening to me during that time, I appreciate that. So probably about 1.5 years ago, I got the idea for this workshop. Many folks are always asking for ethics trainings, particularly since now in West Virginia we have the requirement that we have to do ethics hours as well as as part of our continuing education. So I'm always trying to find different ways to make that a little bit different, or find a different perspective on the ethics thing. So probably 1.5 years ago, I got to thinking about how ethics and empathy, I feel like really kind of go together in our profession and what we do. So in this workshop, kind of what we do is that we spend about the first half of our time talking about the social work code of ethics. And then we talk a little bit about empathy and defining what that is. And then at the end, we kind of bring those two things together, and kind of see how those do go hand in hand, and how empathy really is a part of what we do, and really I think is an ethical obligation of us in our careers. So anyway, let me get over here to the right screen, and we'll get to clicking. So again, there I am. There's where I am in life right now at Concord. Some objectives, we have those listed here, and of course we're going to look at the core values and the code of ethics. We'll be able to demonstrate comprehension of empathy and what that is. And then by the end of the workshop, we'll kind of see how those two go together. Before we dive into the ethics overview, I'm really laid back. So, if you have a comment or something, I know with this number of people on Zoom, it can be kind of hard sometimes to, jump in and say things, but feel free, if you don't want to do that, to put it in the chat. And I'm sure Mary or someone will help me recognize when those are there. And I'm happy to take questions that way, entertain comments, or whatever we can do to make sure you all are being heard. Because the way I look at this is, I'm positive many of you have been practicing for many years and have encountered all sorts of ethical things. So I kind of view my role in this as kind of just driving us into remembering, oh yeah, this or that when it comes to the ethics. And then you guys, I'm sure, have lots of experiences, stories, and all those sorts of things too. So we just kind of see this as a refresher kind of thing. So with that said, starting out here, so we kind of look at, what is the code of ethics, and why do we have that document that we all know very well, that we're required to attend trainings on, and we're required to learn about and apply it to our practice daily. Well, first of all, it is a set of standards that guides our conduct as social workers. Pretty much every profession has a code of ethics. Whether you're in the medical field, you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, whatever, we all have ethics. And this is the one that is ours and is unique to us. So it helps us, and we see there in that second point, it offers us a set of values to understand what our profession values and what we hopefully value as well. And it also sets principles and standards to guide our decision making sometimes. We'll mention several times in our hour today that, many times we encounter ethical dilemmas, and we have to figure out how to handle those and what do we do in those situations. And the code of ethics helps us do that. It is irrelevant to all social workers, regardless of the setting that we are in. One thing about social work that's unique is that all of us are social workers, but when you look at the jobs that we do, they look very different sometimes. What I do as a faculty member, looks very different than what someone does working in CPS or working in a nursing home or providing therapeutic services. But at the end of the day, when you look at the base, at the base, at the foundations, what I'm trying to say, of what we do, a lot of that is grounded in the code of ethics, and you truly use it every day, whether you realize that or not. I don't know if on a daily basis I can say, oh yeah, that I just practice ethical principle 1.2 whatever, right? But without knowing it, we do those things. So we talked about what it is. Why do we have this thing called the code of ethics? And why does every profession have those? Well, the first of all, again, as we mentioned earlier, it identifies our core values. Like if we don't have core values, then it's going to be really hard for us to understand what our profession is expecting of us. So it gives us that. It gives us that. Those values are sort of really are that foundation for our practice and what we do. The Code of Ethics summarizes broad ethical principles. It helps us to understand what those principles are at times. And even though sometimes even how the code does that, it can be a little bit complicated and we need a little extra help to understand those things sometimes. It helps us understand and identify when we encounter ethical uncertainties. Now, I'm betting that there's probably not a person here on this call today that has not encountered an ethical uncertainty at some point. We all do, and those can look very different in many different ways, right? Sometimes there'll be an ethical uncertainty. We're trying to figure out what to do when we have maybe a clash between our personal values and what our professional values are. That can be a real sticking point sometimes, and it's important for us to remember that it's okay to have our own personal beliefs and values, but when it comes to working with our clients, we have to practice in accordance to what our profession says is its guidelines, and that can be a challenge sometimes, and we have to work through some of those things sometimes. It sets standards for professional accountability. I've always felt like that is one of the most important pieces when we're talking about ethics in our practice and what we do, is we have to be accountable. Some of you, if you've been in one of my workshops before, you've heard this story before, but it's still the simplest way I can think to explain why that's important. Yeah, way longer than I'd like to admit ago now. When I was an undergraduate student, I was a cook at Bob Evans. And first of all, dear Lord never asked me to cook eggs or anything like that. I can still smell those smells, and it makes me want to run my head through the wall or something. I could identify that anywhere. But anyway, nevertheless, when I was cooking there and I made a mistake, say we burnt a steak or something, right? What do? Well, we threw that away and we started over. We made a mistake and you moved on. I mean, sometimes your manager or something may not be happy that happened, but at the end of the day, it wasn't that big a deal. Bob Evans could afford another steak. In the work that we do, though, when we mess up, it's really hard to start over sometimes, because the work that we do involves people's lives, and empowering people and improving their lives. So when we make mistakes, it's really difficult to start over again. We can't just start from beginning. So that's why I think professional accountability is so important, is because everything we do is impacting someone's life. And that goes all the way, and it doesn't matter again what area of practice that we're in, where it's like what I do and my colleagues do in higher education, all the way again, CPS, youth services, wherever that may be, we're impacting someone's life. And in a lot of the jobs that we do, we're helping people at their most vulnerable points. And that is incredibly important. So to me, that's part of why it is so important to have this professional accountability intact. We also have another thing that the Code of Ethics does is it provides orientation for new practitioners. Those of us who teach classes use the Code of Ethics all the time. There's probably not a single class that's taught in a social work program where a lot of what we're doing is founded in the Code of Ethics. And because, again, it's that foundation level. It's where we build upon when we're learning what we do as social workers. So we use that all the time. It also sets standards for judging unethical behavior. That's another really, really important one, because one of the things we do is we have that professional accountability, and we also sometimes have to hold each other accountable. And that's not an easy thing to do. So if Mary comes to me and says, Sean, I know that you did X, Y, and Z, or you said something or whatever, you might want to rethink doing that. That's going to be really important to me, because I respect Mary as my colleague in the profession, and I'll think, she's right. I probably shouldn't have done that. But also, though, if Mary's coming to me with that, she's also wants to be able to say, in our code of ethics, it says yada yada yada, and that's the area that you want to be careful with when doing that. Conversations like that aren't easy, but they're very important, because again, everything we do is impacting others' lives and impacting their situations. So we want to keep that in mind. Y'all, also, just to point out, I know that I talk fast, so please, if somebody tell me to slow down, I'm fine with that. Also, I grew up in McDowell County. That's why I sound this way. So if something don't make a whole lot of sense, tell me. I'll stop and help clear that up too. But as we've just talked about that, though, with what our ethics are, we also need to spend just a minute talking about what professional ethics are not. I always include this in every one of these workshops that I do, because I think it's really important to remember. Our professional ethics are not feelings. That's something that's really important to remember. Now, that's not to say that there might be times where you'll have this feeling something just isn't right. And there is some foundation for that in the code of ethics. For you all, you've studied the code of ethics, you practice these things, you've learned these things. So many times when something isn't quite right, you do get a feeling about that. However, that's not exactly what our professional ethics are. If I'm having a feeling something's a little bit icky, I'm going to refer to that and try to figure out, is that feeling grounded in fact or not? So that's something that's really important. Professional ethics are not laws. There's not laws that say, you have to do X, Y, and Z necessarily. At the same time, there's conflict sometime between our professional ethics and what laws actually are. You've seen in the news various things like that in the past, when there's laws and policies that are passed that just completely conflict with what we do as social workers and how we try to help individuals. That's when things like being policy active and being and advocating and those sorts of things are really important. So keep that in mind. It can also be laws. If it's religion, my personal religion is very, very important to me, right? But that's not necessarily where my professional ethics come from. Now, they may lean into that sometimes, right? But that's not exactly where it comes from. And we understand that, just because we practice certain religion, faith, spirituality, whatever, doesn't mean that everyone practices that same thing. And so that's not where our professional ethics necessarily come from. One of my personal favorites, professional ethics are not what everyone is doing. Have you ever went to a job and you're trying to do something and you're trying to do things what you think is the right way, or maybe you're doing what you're even told in some instances, and somebody else is like, that's not exactly how we do that here. Right? That kind of stuff happens, but it's up to us to decide, okay, but is how everyone else is doing that here, is it the ethical way to do that? So we have to keep that in mind. It's how, like my mom used to say, if everyone else was jumping off a bridge, would you, right? It's that kind of mentality, so we have to be careful with those things. We have to be able sometimes to challenge those things, and that's really important. Also, our professional ethics are not an exact science. So there is no computer system that I can go to and I can say, Mary did this. Is this a violation of the code of ethics? And it will print out, and print out, hey, yes, Mary is in violation of the code of ethics, or Mary is not. Now, I will say with Chat GPT, it might be fun to try that sometime and see what it says, but that's still not an exact science and where you should get your advice from on ethical situations. So, there's a lot of gray area in ethics. There's lots of things that come up that, we have to take a harder look at to understand where they're coming from, because it's not necessarily black and white. Okay. So with that said, and we've sort of laid groundwork of kind of in general what professional ethics are, and what they are not. Let's talk about take a few minutes to talk about those core values of social work. Again, those values are what is very much the foundation, the base level of what we do in practice. No matter what area we're in, no matter where we work, these definitely should be things that we're practicing on a daily basis, and I would guarantee you that most of you do. So the first one is service. Social workers' primary goal is to help people in need and address social problems. That's very important. And that seems, when you first read that, one of our core values is service, that seems pretty simple, right? Like, oh, we provide services. Obviously we do. But it's not just that we provide services, that we're ethically obligated to do that. And those services can look very differently at times. But one of our goals is to help people when they're in need. And that service is not just at that one-on-one level sometimes, depending on what we do, right? Many of you, I'm sure, offer groups, and we work in macro practice where we do community kind of things. In their definition there mentions social problems. That's another thing that we do, is we try to help address social issues, and we help to advocate for individuals who are at high risk in various ways. Before I came to Concord, one of my big areas of practice was in gerontology. So, in my world, I spent a lot of time advocating for seniors and their rights, and making sure they had what they need. And each of you have your own area where you're practicing, where you're doing that same kind of thing. That goes along in with the services we provide too. So it's not just we're necessarily just providing service, it's how we're getting to that point to provide those services. That macro work sometimes is so important, even to be able to have services to provide. So that's important. The next one is dignity and worth of the person. And what it says here is that we respect that every single person, no matter who they are, should be treated with dignity and has worth. Now, you think when we're talking about that, you can say, well, Sean, of course they do. I mean, what kind of monster do you think I am if I don't believe that, right? But one of the things that we have to remember is every single person has biases, whether they're aware of those or not. And I think it's really important that you are aware of those. Now, a bias can be many things, right? Like a bias for me could be, I prefer hamburgers over hot dogs. That's a pretty simple, easy thing, right? That's my opinion. But but sometimes biases can also go into areas that we just definitely don't want them to be, but they do at times. And those things can come from, family, from things in society, all those sorts of things. But it's important to us as social workers, no matter how we feel about a certain situation, that we treat everyone with dignity and worth. I'll give you an example. And well, not many times, but several times in my time here on campus, I can think of one in particular where a student came to me and said, because I used to be our field director for several years. A student came to me one time and said, Sean, I'm worried about where I'm going to do my placement. And we were kind of talking about it, and they said, I'm worried about working with this certain population. Now, what they said, it wasn't like, there wasn't like racism or homophobia or anything like that in it, because if it were, we'd have been having a completely different conversation about, maybe you shouldn't be a social worker. Had those before too, and I'm sure many of my colleagues in higher education have as well. But this person was worried about working with a certain population. So I said, one of the things I would tell you is that, as you're going out in the field or as you're going out into work, you may not want to go and start out working directly with that population every single day. But I promise you, no matter where you work, that population is going to come in your door. because that's what happens. As we all know, wherever we work, like I mentioned, I worked in aging services. Well, did that mean I never worked with a child no matter what? Absolutely not. In West Virginia, 52% of grandparents are raising grandchildren. So there was many times someone had an issue involving a grandchild. We have to help them figure that out, right? And other family members and that sort of thing. And the inverse is true. If you're working with children, you end up working with their families, you end up working with older adults, and so on and so forth. So it's not, so social work doesn't happen in a silo, right? I mean, we can't, I mean, now obviously I'm not an expert on children's services, don't claim to be. My method was finding someone who did know what to do and then getting that person to the services they needed, or someone who could help them get there. But my point is, if I had, for some reason, had this really big issue, I just didn't want to work with kids for some reason, that's just not going to work. So we have to remember that treating everyone with dignity and worth is so important. And the other thing with that is, y'all, and I know, I mean, this is going to sound controversial. That's really not. But sometimes you work with people that just annoy you. I mean, that just happens. And that happens with other colleagues sometimes, right? But we still treat those people with dignity and worth. And we provide them services just as much as we do anyone else, because that's just how it has to be. Okay. The importance of human relationships. In social work, we understand that this is a central importance in what we do. If there wasn't a need for human relationships, I don't even know if our profession would exist, right? We understand how important those are, and we understand how those impact what we do. That relationship can be us to our client, right? It can be us to that client's family, and that client's relationships with other people impact what we do working with our clients as well. Again, as we mentioned earlier, family is a really big part most of the time. So, but also the inverse can be true when we're trying to help someone make change in their lives. If there's no one else involved in their life, you see this a lot with older adults who are isolated. If all your family's passed away, you're somewhere not near them. Trying to build those human relationships and using that part of that change can be hard sometimes. I remember in my previous job, I'll never forget, there was a lady that called one day, and she was working with one of our caseworkers, and this caseworker is just, there's not enough nice words I could ever say about her. She was one of those people who has the patience of Job. You know what I mean? If you want to talk 3 hours, she's going to talk to you 3 hours, that kind of thing. And anyway, long story short, she was on the phone with this person for quite a while. And afterwards, she came and told me, she said, Sean, this person I just spoke with, they don't have anybody. And in every support we'd try to help them with, we're trying to find a way around that, because there's none of those informal supports to help her. So anyway, but she said, in this conversation, when we're working on all this, the person said, could you call me, or I call you about once a week just to check in? Because she said, I just don't have anybody, and and it's just really nice to have that human interaction. So sometimes our roles can be as simple as that, as we are that person that someone can confide in and talk to about whatever's going on in their life. And that was just one of those examples of how important those human relationships can be. Integrity is so important, y'all. We have to be trustworthy. We have to follow through with what we say we're going to. That's so important. When I was a supervisor, I had a steadfast rule that, we don't have to know every answer off the top of our head, right? There's no way we can ever do that. But if someone called and they had a question, we would at least get their information, find out that answer for them, or where they could get that answer, and call them back and make sure that information got to them. That's just really important. And one of the things, it is so important for all social workers, no matter where we are, to operate with integrity and do what we say we're going to do. But I'd argue in rural Appalachia, it's even more important. Now you think about, why is that? Well, does anybody around you know that you're a social worker? Yeah. Where I come from, the holler I grew up in, if the social worker was coming up the holler, but when they entered the mouth of the holler, the people at the head of the holler already knew, right? So people know who you are and what you do. And if I don't follow through with somebody, or if I make a promise to someone I don't keep, that's going to do a few things. Number one, it's going to really hurt that relationship with that client and them not get the services they need. That's going to hurt my relationship with future people that come to me, because they're going to come in not trusting me. Now, not to say every client that comes in trusts you, of course you're not. You've got to build that over time. But if they already know I've lied to somebody, that's going to be harmful. That's going to be harmful to me in my career too, right? So operating with integrity, that is a very important piece of what we talk about. Competence. We must be competent in the area we are practicing. And that can be accomplished in a wide variety of ways. First of all, when we first come into jobs, we have to understand what is our role, what do we do, who are we working with, what are the services we provide, all those sorts of things. And me knowing that just because I've been a social worker 20 years doesn't mean I can go out and suddenly go into an area of practice that I've never been in and think I know how to do everything, because I'm not going to know. And I got to figure that out. Competence is why we have these things like continuing education, and we always keep ourselves updated on what's going on in the world. And because when we're practicing without competence, that can be dangerous. And we've all seen that before, I'm sure. And that can be very difficult. So working in confidence, we mentioned, like I mentioned, the CE thing. It's why some of us end up going back to school to learn more. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you that I can remember when I decided to go get my MSW and ended up at WVU. Here in the southern part of the state, when I first graduated with an undergraduate degree, I went straight into a job as a supervisor because there wasn't people around to do those kind of things. And so when you came in and agencies had these policies that you had to have a certain degree to do things, they had someone with a degree, you got thrown into it. And so after about a year or so, I said, I need to figure out how to do this, because I'm not doing it very effectively. And so I said, well, you know what, maybe getting an MSW, let's start there. Then that was, of course, one of the best decisions I made, and did help tremendously. And it helped me to become more competent, in what I was doing at that time. So competence, that's a really important one. The last one, and I always highlight this one, or bolded, underlined it, something like that, is social justice. That's our sixth core value. Now, normally in a situation that's more conducive to conversation, I ask people, why is that? But to save you all the hassle, I'll kind of act that out for you. But normally I ask people, why is that? Why would I put this emphasis on social justice? And people, say a wide variety of things. But at the end of the day, this is kind of the thing that sets our profession apart from other things. No other profession puts the emphasis on social justice in their code of ethics like ours do. I know several years ago there was no other profession that had it in their code of ethics. I don't know if that's changed or not over the last few years, but I know that it's not a core foundation piece for any other profession but ours. And usually at this point I ask, what is social justice? And there's lots of good conversations that come out of that. But I'll tell you one thing that people always say is they say, well, social justice means equality. There is a piece of equality in it, but that's not really exactly what social justice is. So we see here that social workers challenge social injustice, and I'm going to show you all of the illustration that I think helps illustrate that a little bit. So I mentioned that folks often tell me when I ask that social justice means equality. Well, if you look at this picture here, we have with on the left there, we have the first illustration is equality, right? Every person there has the exact same amount of support, right? Equal treatment. Well, let's look at how that's working out. Now, these folks are trying to look over to see this soccer game that's going on. Well, our guy there on the left, he can see over just fine with that one box, right? The person in the middle, she can see over just fine, but the person on to the right still can't see. They have the exact same amount of support as everyone else has, right? They're getting treated equally, but they still are not getting to the goal where they need to be. They still can't see over the fence. Well, a lot of the work we do ends up in that middle box with equity. Okay. But, and why is that? Well, we tend to try to offer people the support they need to get them where they need to be, right? Whatever that goal is, whatever that change is, we're trying to help them get to. So with the equity piece there, you can see they all have different levels of support. Well, the first person didn't need a box at all to be able to see over the fence, right? The no additional support was needed other than what they naturally have. The person in the middle needed that one box, that a little bit of support to get there. But the person on the right needed those two boxes. They needed additional support to get to the goal of being able to see over the fence or whatever the case is. Think about in your own work. I know you all have clients like this, right? That sometimes need more support than others do to get them where they need to be. And there's lots of reasons for that, right? There's lots of demographic reasons that could be. There's lots of, geography can even play a role, right? Like where I grew up in the big city of Panther, West Virginia, that I guarantee you most of you've never heard of, opportunities are way different than they are, say, in Charleston, West Virginia. And that's not to say everybody in Charleston has all these great opportunities. It's not what I'm saying, but the factors are different. So yeah, so the amount of support needed changes, and that's where we end up doing a lot of the work we do with folks, particularly when we're working with a client or working with a family. Is we look at those, we look at trying to get that correct amount of support in. However, where we aim to get is on the far right in that justice area. That's where justice starts coming in. And what you see there is the barrier that was causing the need for the support is gone. And see, as you can see here, the causes of the inequity were addressed. That's where we strive to get to. That's where a lot of our policy work, our advocation, those kind of things come from, right? Think about in your own work, there may be times that you've been working with a client and you're trying to remove some barrier. It's not just the support for them to get over that barrier, but you're trying to get that barrier out of the way. And that's a really important place to be. And that's really important work that we do. These can be, that work can be, again, really big things like at a national level, all the way down to state and local levels, or even inside your own agency. Sometimes your agencies will have policies that tend to be a barrier to getting client support, and we try to remove those barriers. So that's where the justice piece comes in, is that we're not only trying to offer the right amount of support, but we're trying to remove the barrier that's causing the need for the support. Okay. I can see a few people. Does that make sense where we're at so far? Okay, cool. It's so hard, y'all, when you don't get a lot of feedback. It's like, I hope we're doing okay. We'll see how things are going. But anyway, so hopefully that makes sense. And then finally, on our ethics overview, when we're looking at this, we also have responsibilities to many people. Now, when I talk a lot about clients, right? Because I think that's what we think of in practice so much, is the work that we do with our clients. And when we're talking about dignity and worth of the person and all those things, we think automatically about clients. But our responsibilities, though, to our profession go beyond that. We also have these responsibilities to colleagues, and some of the things that we just talked about relate there as well. When we're talking, again, we mentioned dignity and worth of the person. Well, that extends to our colleagues as well. Sometimes we help each other provide services and all those sorts of things. We have ethical responsibilities to our practice settings, where we are and where we're practicing. Lots of times we talk about how we're social workers on and off duty, because the things we do not only reflect on our profession, which is the next, but also on the agency we're working for as well. And that's really important. We have responsibilities as professionals. Of course, we have responsibilities to the social work profession as a whole, as we just mentioned. Just because I don't work in children's services, say, doesn't mean I shouldn't be mindful and be a supporter of those policies and things that are really important in that world or in any of the practice areas in the world that we practice. And also we have responsibilities to broader society. when you think about our profession is the only one that puts the emphasis on social justice that it does, that becomes a big responsibility sometimes. Now, that's not to say there's not many other folks who aren't social workers out there worried about these things. Of course they are, but we are ethically obligated to care about justice and to be working toward that in society. So now that's really important. So we have those things. Okay, so that is just sort of a quick and dirty overview of all those different concepts. I have workshops that drill way deeper into many of those ethical things if you're interested. I have one that's like a 5-hour workshop that's just on the core values, because there's so much we could talk about at all of those levels. However, for the sake of time today, and so Mary doesn't kick me off of here, we're not going to do that. But just know that there's so much more we could go into. But that sort of lays the groundwork then to getting into the talking about empathy, which is I feel like we could apply empathy to every single one of those things we just talked about in understanding what we do. So one of the first things we want to do then is, you hear that term empathy, and we all have different ideas of what that means. There's even a segment out there that even sort of sees empathy as a dirty word, which just is mind-boggling to me, because I think it's so important in what we do and being a functioning society. But I pulled a couple of different definitions here of what exactly is empathy. That word you've heard many times. Well, I don't usually read off the slides, but let me read this to you. It's the direct identification with, understanding of, and vicarious experience of another person's situation, feelings, and motives. Okay, so we're trying to understand basically where someone else is in that moment. Okay, think about, we tell students all the time in education that you have to start where your client is. We say that all the time, and clients can be in various places. Well, when we do that, we're practicing empathy. Now, we all know that if someone is extremely worried about something that seems trivial to us, that doesn't really matter what it means to us. We have to start and help that person get that need met before we can move on to other things, because they're so occupied with that one thing. When we're doing that and understanding their situation and trying to understand how they feel there, we're working toward empathy. So empathy is the ability to understand and share the thoughts or feelings of another. Okay, it's not just the sympathy kind of thing, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But it's the more truly trying to understand and to share where that person's coming from. It's not necessary always for us to have had the same experiences. Now, there's times that we have, right? I've several of my colleagues here know I lost my dad this past summer. So when someone's talking about losing a parent, I can say, well, I've been through that, and I do have some understanding of how you feel. Now, that doesn't mean my experience, though, is exactly the same as someone else who's been in that same experience. So it's still important for me, not to just say, oh, I know how you feel. Well, I may, even though we have a shared experience, I may still not fully understand how they feel, and I need to allow them to tell me that. Rather, empathy is an attempt to better understand that person's perspective and giving them the opportunity to share their perspective. That's very important when we talk about this. Now, lots of times individuals use empathy and sympathy sort of interchangeably. Okay, but they're really different things, and that's what this chart illustrates. In empathy, again, as we mentioned, we're understanding someone's experience, and we're trying to put ourselves in their shoes. That's a really important piece of that, is trying to really understand and feel what that is. Whereas sympathy, we're acknowledging this person's emotion, and we're seeing that they are going through something, but we're not really truly understanding or feeling that. An example, if someone's trying to lose weight, example of empathy is, I know it's not easy to lose weight because I face the same problems myself. Well, now again, as I mentioned, we have to be careful with that, because even though we face that problem, may not be feeling the same way about it. So we have to be careful with that. Sympathy is more of trying to lose weight can be an uphill battle. And absolutely that can be, right, along with many other things. But that's the sympathy, where we're recognizing it, but we're not necessarily relating it to ourselves or trying to feel it. The relationship in empathy is a personal understanding of where the person's coming from. Where sympathy is more of just understanding the experience of others, not personalizing it. And then that's what we talk about there at the scope. The scope of these things. Empathy is that more personal scope, and it can be applied to many different instances. Whereas sympathy is just sort of from one group to many, and it's not as personal of a scope of what we're looking at. I'm not saying sympathy is a terrible thing. That's not what we're doing, but we're saying we strive, we work with our clients to be more toward that empathy area, because of how important it is. So there are different types of empathy when we talk about this. And the first one is cognitive empathy. And that is the ability to understand how a person feels or what they might be thinking. That cognitive empathy helps a lot with communication, because we try to understand what someone's saying, and relay to them that we're understanding where they're coming from. That's that cognitive empathy. Emotional empathy is also sometimes called affective empathy, is the ability to share the feelings of another, like your pain is my pain kind of thing. And this helps to build connections when you're really trying at an emotional level to understand where someone's coming from, and that's really important too. And it really plays a role too in how we work with people and how we practice these, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, there's compassionate empathy, also known as empathetic. And it goes beyond just simply understanding and sharing feelings. It actually moves toward taking action. What we do as social workers, doing something to try to help this person that's in this difficult situation, and understanding where they're coming from. Okay, so we have the cognitive one where we're think more of listening, understanding. The emotional one where we're sort of feeling that at a personal level, and then compassionate is where we end up kind of trying to help do something about it. To save time, I told Mary I'd do this. I had videos, but there's no way we're going to have enough time to go through those, but that's okay. But I love Big Bang Theory. This is a scene from there. Long story short, Sheldon is explaining something that feels very important to him. Another person's kind of like, that's important to you? And then he says, well, that kind of hurts my feelings because you didn't take into account how I felt. Totally, it's a really good scene, but there's just not enough time to do that. But you pick out these things if you're careful when you're watching TV, reading a book. You can pick out when empathy is being practiced sometimes, and it's just interesting to see that. So we try to utilize empathetic listening, and it's a way to listen and respond to others that builds toward building trust and mutual understanding. One of the things that can be hard for us to do sometimes is to build rapport with our clients and sometimes even with our colleagues. Well, but if we're showing though that we're at least understanding where the person's coming from and understanding their feelings, that helps build that trust quite a bit. But there's people that we can disagree with on many things sometimes that we work with, but when we show that we're at least trying to understand and be empathetic toward their position, that can help us sometimes, in accomplishing what we need to accomplish. Empathetic listening enables the listener to receive and accurately interpret what's being told to them. Okay, it's so important when we're working with individuals for us to hear what they're saying, not just listening. My wife, she accuses me of this all the time, right? Sean, you're not hearing me though. And so I get a lot of practice of this at home, but it's also hearing what's being said to us and trying to understand that person's perspective. That other bullet point there talks about this is an integral part of the listening process, is being able to hear what's being said and sometimes even be able to say back, Mary, I hear what you're saying to me, and then kind of let me make sure I'm getting this right, to understand how Mary's feeling in whatever situation she's in. So when we practice empathetic listening, there's many benefits to it. First of all, I mentioned it builds trust. That's so important in the work that we do, is having the trust of the people that we're trying to help make change in their lives. If someone doesn't trust us, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to get where we're trying to get to and to help them make whatever change they're having. And also builds respect. We need to do our best to have respect for our clients, for our colleagues, for the people around us, and likewise the other direction. It enables the other person to release their emotions. It's really hard to be vulnerable and tell someone what you're going through, or even to ask for help if it doesn't feel like the words you say are saying matter. If I'm working with someone and they're telling, and they've got all these things going on, but to them, their biggest issue right now is they don't have food for their dog in their house. If I'm not acknowledging I hear that and that's important to them, and we're going to try to get that need addressed, it's going to be really hard for them to tell me anything else, right? So it's really important that we make sure that people understand that we are hearing what they're saying to us, and that we're being empathetic. Helps reduce tensions. Y'all know many of you have jobs that there can be tense situations at times, but at least if someone understands that you're hearing what they're saying, that can help that sometimes. Encourages other information. So when someone's comfortable with you and they can tell you truly are concerned with what they're going through and you're feeling what they are, it allows you to get other information you may need to be able to help them. Also, creating a safe environment is very important as well and that helps build that. Now, there's some things that this type of listening is not, okay? I never noticed how much I like to tell people things are not too. Like I told you what's not ethics. So here's what's not empathetic listening. Giving advice like, I think you should. That's not necessarily empathetic listening. I'm as guilty as the day is long. If someone's saying to me, this is going on, well, you know what you should do, instead of hearing them out at times, that can be a problem. Explaining your situation, but I didn't mean to. Well, if something's happened with someone and say you've hurt them, I mean, they need to be able to say what they need to say first before you can do that. Correcting the person. Wait, I never said that. That can be a problem. Consoling the person. You did the best you could. Sometimes that's not helpful. Again, Jamie kills me for always telling stories about my wife and these things, but here we are. She tells me all the time, Sean, I'll be trying to fix something or say you this or that, and she'll say, Sean, I don't need you to fix it. I just need you to hear me. And I'm like, yeah, I hear what you're saying. So, these workshops are good practice for me too. I'm really bad with this one. Sometimes empathetic listening doesn't always include things like you telling your story, right? Well, that reminds me of a time. Sometimes you need to let that person get out what they are feeling, and you hear what they're saying before you decide to use any self-disclosure from your own situation, and that's important. Um, Shutting down feelings. Oh, cheer up! Don't be so mad. That's not good in these situations. Sympathizing can be difficult. Things like, oh, you poor thing. Interrogating, why'd you do that? Evaluating, you're just too realistic. And then also one-upping, well, that's nothing, listen to that, and you start telling your story again. Now, that's not saying sometimes when we share things out of our own lives, that we're doing something bad, right? Lots of times I'm saying, oh, well, let me tell you what happened, because I'm trying to show that I understand what you're going through and that sort of thing. But when it comes to truly empathetic listening, and particularly with the clients we work with, though, that's not always helpful. We have to be careful with that. That's the other cute video I was going to show that we don't have time for, but it's from Inside Out. I use Inside Out all the time because there's so much social worky stuff in there. Long story short, in this one, there's a character that's really upset. There's another one that's constantly trying to cheer them up no matter what. But the third character enters and is basically like listening to what they're saying. It's like, oh, this, and sharing with them how they're sad about a certain situation. Then at the end of the scene, it's like, oh, I feel better. This person kind of cried out how they were feeling and felt heard. If you've ever seen the movie, you know the scene. It's super. So some tips for when we're practicing empathy, being non-judgmental. That is so important. There are times that clients, colleagues, people in your everyday life that will tell you things that will just blow your mind. But it's important to be non-judgmental in those situations. Giving someone your undivided attention is very important, and listening carefully. Be sure you know who you're listening to, and that they know that you're listening to them. Not being afraid of silence, that's one I've always had a problem with. If you know me, you know I have trouble shutting up sometimes. So silence can, but not being afraid of silence and allowing time for things to process is important. Restating and paraphrasing sometimes, being sure you understand what someone's telling you. That's also accomplished through follow-up. And restating sometimes, hey, so what you're telling me is this, what I'm hearing is this, and making sure you understand where the person's coming from. And then here's some just a little chart of some different elements that we've talked about when it comes to empathetic listening. Keeping opinions to yourself. The silence thing you see there with pause, paraphrasing, and nonverbal communication. That's a really important one too, because we know through our communication techniques that we pick up so much through that. So I kind of picked up speed here a minute because I wanted to make sure we got to this. So here's where we draw that connection then. We talked about ethics. We spent the last about 15 minutes talking about empathy, what it is, and empathetic listening. So then what is that connection between the code of ethics and empathy? Well, these are just a few of them, but there can also be many. First of all, with our core values, it'd be very difficult for us to provide services when the person we're trying to help doesn't feel like we understand their problem. If they're not getting that we are being empathetic and we're understanding where they're coming from, then that can be a challenge. And so it relates itself to service. With dignity and worth of the person, connecting empathetically demonstrates that we value the individual. It's really hard if someone doesn't feel heard for them to believe that we value them or value what they're saying. And so that's important. The importance of human relationships. Again, empathetically is a great way to connect and make that connection. The things we just talked about, practicing that listening. And it shows that, that how much we value those relationships. Integrity. If clients don't think we're listening effectively, how can they trust us with their story? I mentioned earlier how important it is that we build that trust. And if we don't have that, it's going to be very hard to practice with integrity. Competence, these skills are part of our competent practice, right? Being like Sean, getting used to using silence was something that took me a long time to get through, but I knew that and I worked on that. And we understand that we have to allow this effective listening for us to be able to provide effective interventions as well. Being able to truly understand where that person's coming from. With social justice, connecting to others can be a great incentive for working to change the system. Okay, if we don't fully understand what people that are different from us are going through, it's going to be hard for us to advocate for things that are needed. So we have to remember that, and we have to display that understanding. In our responsibility as clients, one of our primary responsibilities is the well-being of our clients, and using empathy demonstrates that. With colleagues, it can assist us in navigating different phases of those collegial relationships, right? Sometimes there's disputes between colleagues. That happens. No one here's ever dealt with that, I'm sure, but that happens, right? And we have to be mindful of that. And using empathy can help iron out some of those issues. Also, empathy, like we mentioned earlier, I said if I'm doing something I shouldn't, and Mary comes to me, and I need to listen to what she has to say and why she's feeling that, and hopefully she'd listen to me as well, right? And we would share that empathy, at least understanding. Doesn't make whatever I did right, but at least we're understanding, because that makes a difference in when having those kinds of conversations. Okay. And finally, there's the love of my life, and there's my contact info. Guys, I thank you all so much for